Welcome to Class 12 for Hebrew 1 and 2 for Bright OT 500. We have talked about the perfect verb in the cal stem. Now we are on the imperfect verb in the cal stem, looking specifically in this lesson at the weak verb, those that have a weak consonant or perhaps two weak consonants or are even missing a consonant, as in the biconsonantal, and how they react when they're put into the imperfect form. A quick reminder before we begin that the cal imperfect strong verb follows the I-Guttural form with a heroic preformative and a holum stem vowel. This is as opposed to the cal perfect strong verb that is a katal form with a komets under the first root letter and a patak under the second. The vowel patterns will change though when we have weak consonants. Gutturals continue to make life miserable for Hebrew students, and the same is true in the imperfect inflection. You'll notice here once again that compound schwas are preferred by the gutturals. They will take a hataf patak instead of the vocal schwa. We also notice that gutturals prefer patak as the theme vowel instead of holum. So even though there is the heroic preformative, instead of a holum over the second root letter, we have patak under the second root letter, so that we have yiktal instead of yiktol. Various changes take place when the first root letter of a verb is a guttural. You will notice almost immediately that the schwa has changed to a compound schwa, as we would expect with gutturals. However, this schwa was a silent schwa as part of the verb stem. Here it's been replaced by a compound schwa, which is not silent. Compound schwas are always vocal. This, in turn, influences the vowel that serves as the preformative vowel under the preformative prefix. So instead of having a heroic as the vowel under the preformative, in type 1 we have segol, influenced by the compound hataf segol under the first root letter guttural. We also then have an A-class vowel as the second root letter vowel, the theme vowel, as is expected in words with a guttural, as you noticed from the previous slide, yiktal. In type 2, however, a A-class compound schwa, a hataf patak, has been preferred by the ayin and by several of the gutturals that will appear as the first root letter, which influences the preformative vowel to not be a heroic or a segol, but to be a patak. And it influences the theme vowel, which was a patak in type 1, to be a holum, which is more in line with the strong verb than with a verb with a guttural. When we notice these changes, however, we'll note that they're fairly simple, all affected by the presence of the compound schwa replacing that silent schwa. You will either have a patak theme vowel or a holum theme vowel, segol with the patak with the holum. Unusual changes take place as well when a yod is the first letter of the root. The yod combines with the heroic of the preformative to become a long vowel, except instead of having heroic yod, you most often have seire. The theme vowel is no longer an O-class holum, but also becomes seire, so that the vowel pattern is seire. Except in type 2, when the yod remains occasionally, in fact, sometimes even becomes vav because of the underlying historical vav that was replaced by the yod, and does take the heroic to form a heroic yod unchangeably long vowel as the preformative, followed by a patak theme vowel. So as we look at this pattern, we most often expect seire, but occasionally heroic yod patak as the theme vowels. Unusual changes also take place when nun is the first letter of the root. In most cases, nun will assimilate into the next consonant as a dagesh and retain a holum as the theme vowel. Thus, in the first column, the verb nafal, to fall, has become yipol, with the nun assimilating into the pei as a dagesh forte and a holum vav remaining over the pei. This is not always the case, though, as you see in type 2, where occasionally the nun will assimilate into the second letter and instead of a holum have a patak. In this case, the patak is most likely because of the presence of a guttural at the end of the word. Thus, type 2 is actually another type of doubly weak verb, because of the presence of a guttural and the presence of a nun. When the middle letter is a guttural and the first letter is a nun, the nun cannot assimilate into the second root letter because gutturals do not take dagesh forte, in which case the nun will remain. Occasionally, lamed will act the same way. The most famous example is the verb lakach, to take, where the lamed will assimilate into the kof on a regular basis, looking very much like a nun, but the word is not nakach, meaning to gore, but lakach, meaning to take. Not all verbs that start with lamed will do this. Lakach is the most common, but it is something to be aware of. Typically, an assimilated letter into the second letter of the root is a nun that has assimilated. Unusual things also happen when aleph is the first root letter. In many cases, the word will function very similar to other verbs that have a guttural as the first root letter. Segol will become the vowel under the preformative, and a compound schwa, a hatuf segol, will be the vowel under the guttural, and the O-class theme vowel, the holum, will remain. You'll notice in the 2FS, the 3MP, and the 2MP that patak has replaced the segols. This is because of the presence of the strong vowel at the end of the word, serving as the subject ending, as the suffix, thus as a chain reaction affecting the vowels at the beginning of the word. In other cases, though, in what we often call angry baker verbs, which I'll explain on the next slide, the aleph actually quiesces, the preformative vowel becomes a holum, and the theme vowel becomes a patak. This is very unusual, as it's related to other pei aleph or one aleph verbs, but these verbs are fairly common and you'll get used to seeing it. Type 2 pei aleph or one aleph verbs are often called angry baker verbs because of this particular saying. These are the only pei aleph or one aleph verbs that follow type 2. Imagine a baker is yelling at someone. I said, I want you to eat what I bake, or I may seize you and you will perish. Thus we have the verbs say, want, eat, bake, seize, although sometimes seize will follow type 1, and perish. Remembering this little mnemonic can help explain why particular verbs in the pei aleph or one aleph have behaved the way that they have, taking the holum preformative vowel and the patak theme vowel with a quiescent aleph. Sometimes the third root letter will be an aleph, in which case the word will function similarly to a verb that has a guttural as the third root letter, except that aleph typically quiesces. We would expect a hierik under the preformative and a patak under the second letter of the root, as is the case in most gutturals. However, because the aleph has quiesced and because it is a guttural that does its own thing, it becomes a long A comets. You will notice that the 3FP and the 2FP, because of the presence of na at the end of the word as the subject marker suffix, have caused the comets underneath the tzade to become a segol. This is unusual, but not that difficult to notice. Third hey verbs also like to do their own thing, although third hey verbs are very similar in the imperfect as they are in the perfect. Hey will drop in forms with a subject ending, just as we saw in the perfect. Third hey verbs in the imperfect prefer segol as the theme vowel, instead of a holum or a patak, when the hey does remain on the verb form. You'll also notice that segol yod appears in the 3FP and the 2FP before the nun of the subject ending. Again, very similar to the perfect form, where the hey became a hierik yod. Here it becomes segol yod, because the hey prefers a segol in the imperfect. So we have three types of third hey forms. Those where the hey remains, albeit with a segol. Those where the hey drops completely, those that have a vowel at the end, the 3MP, 3FP, 2MP, and 2FP, and those where the hey drops and becomes the segol yod, which are those that have na in the 3FP and 2FP. Not to be left out, geminates also do their own thing in the imperfect. They will retain, in many cases, the holum theme vowel, but will instead have a comets instead of the expected heuric as the preformative. You will notice that the holum reduces in the 3FP and the 2FP to a kibbutz, just as we saw with third aleph or lamed aleph verbs on the previous slide, where the A-class comets has reduced to a short segol. In the second column, the preformative vowel is a heuric, as is expected of the typical strong imperfect verb, the yiktol. There is a dagesh forte in the samic here in this column because heuric is a short vowel and needs something to close that syllable. In fact, as you glance at this chart, you will notice that wherever a short vowel has been inserted, there is a dagesh forte in the following letter. The same is true in the third column for type 2, where in the 2FS and the 3MP and the 2MP, there is a dagesh forte in the second root letter because of the presence of a short vowel under the first letter of the root. In this case, it is patak, which is quite a bit different than the expected holum, and yet you can see the pattern that follows. Tsere becomes the preformative vowel, and patak becomes the theme vowel. The easiest weak verb in the imperfect is probably the biconsonantal. The hollow vowel that appears in the infinitive also appears in all forms in the imperfect, and the first vowel, that under the preformative, will be a comets. Everything else stays the same. Here are some helpful questions to ask when trying to identify two-letter roots in the imperfect. Is there a dagesh in the first visible letter of the root? If the root letter that is first visible is not the first letter of the actual word, then it is probably an assimilated nun or lamed. Vocabulary will help you to know if this is the case because you will know words that start with nun or lamed that you can try. If, as it turns out, the first visible root letter is the actual first root letter of the verb is probably a geminate, especially if the preformative vowel is a short vowel. If, however, the first vowel is a sere, then the verb is probably a one yod, especially if it is tsere tsere as the verb pattern. It may, however, be a geminate if the second vowel is a patak, so you will have to check the theme vowel. Is the first vowel a comets? Then the verb is probably a geminate, as geminates will often have comets under the preformative. However, it is possible for a hollow biconsonantal verb to also have a comets under the preformative, although the presence of the hollow vowel should give it away because you'll have 3 root letters instead of just 2. A final question to ask is the connecting vowel in the third person plural form segol yod? Then the verb is a geminate, if it's an O-class second vowel, or a third hey, in which case you will have a silent schwa as the second vowel. Again, checking the theme vowel in addition to the connecting vowel will tell you what exactly you have. These verbs look funny, but they follow the patterns that we've already discussed. A third hey verb will have segol hey when the hey appears. The hey will drop before the strong vowel endings in the 2FS, 3MP, and 2MP, and will become a segol yod in the 3FP and 2FP before the approaching nun. First yod verbs have the pattern of tsere tsere, except in the 3FP and 2FP where it's tsere patak, because of the influence of the na at the end of the verb. In column 3, we have an assimilated nun that is assimilated into the second letter, still with an I-class preformative. We know this is not a geminate because of our vocab. This is not palal, this is nafal. Although it is possible that it could be palal, to praise, but we need to ask ourselves, based on the context and based on the vocabulary that we know, which verb it is. I know that's a lot of information and a lot of changes that take place, However, if you go back and look at the various charts, you will see that the majority of them follow the pattern of having either an I-class preformative with an O-class theme vowel, an I-class preformative vowel with an A-class theme vowel, or perhaps a tsere or a patak as the preformative vowel, and either a holum or another tsere as the theme vowel. If you keep this in mind, although there are many changes, they will be easier to identify as you will recognize them by the vowel patterns as imperfects. Go use the Quizlet, study your vocab, and I'll see you in class.